The hegemony of the dollar. Why is it that world currencies should be pegged against the dollar? The Russia-Ukraine conflict has also forced nations to move away from the dollar. This has been happening for a while. Russia actually started this sometime in 2014 since the annexation of Crimea. But there are more and more nations now want to create mutual trade agreements and also bring in tradability between their mutual currencies, or perhaps peg a currency which is agreeable to them that is not the dollar. What is also interestingly happening is many nations are now offloading their dollars and stacking up on gold reserves. Post the pandemic, the last 1.5 to 2 years have seen huge buys of gold by nations who have also offloaded their dollars. Now this entire aspect of de-dollarization, is it actually possible in the current scheme of things? How difficult or easy is it? Let's try and understand. One of the most important aspects is 60% of the central bank reserves globally are in the US dollar. The other aspect is Russia and China mutual trade has been up by 80-fold since 2022. So these are two nations who are clearly wanting to move away from the dollar for their individual respective reasons. Russia, the biggest mover against the dollar since 2014, Crimea annexation. Also, what are the challenges with dollarization? First and most importantly, it's the economic sovereignty of nations that comes under scrutiny and challenge, because it gives the Americans or US control over global economy, especially certain nations. There is also currency manipulation which happens because America can then manipulate currency for economic gain, its own protecting its own economic and of course strategic interests. There is also risk of a financial crisis. So if there is an economic crisis in America, it can trigger a global meltdown and nations will suffer, nations that cannot perhaps print dollars like America can and pull itself out of a situation. We've seen this in the past. Dependence on US trade in dollars can also make nations directly, indirectly dependent on the US. So by default, America then economically controls the world. Geopolitics. Reduce the American influence on other economies. We will destroy you if you act against us. We will impose sanctions against you, make it difficult for you to trade, survive if you act against us. This hegemony will then stop if there is a movement away from the dollar. But that comes with challenges too. The challenges with de-dollarization is whose currency is superior and whose currency should be taken, and what should be the terms of convertibility. So it's limited convertibility. It's not fully convertible. So the use is limited. So if Russia and China were to work on a nexus, they do now, they have come to an agreement, but can all other nations come to an agreement? If there are currency fluctuations, then it could also affect long-term investments. There is no stable peg. That becomes a problem. Limited use in trade is difficult for other nations to also compete. And the dependence on dollar, many nations rely on dollar for trade and finance currently. That's the current ecosystem. I told you 60% of the world's central banks' reserves are in dollars. Financial instability into the dollar contributes to instability in other nations too. Now let's try and understand the history. How did it all start? It started soon after the First World War, when a lot of the gold reserves came to America, and that's when the dollar started beginning to displacing the pound. By 1944, international trade was done using the dollar when 44 countries signed that agreement and decided to use dollar as the peg for trade. Large supply of dollars went spread around the world in the 60s, but by 71, the convertibility of the dollar into gold was ended by Nixon, when other nations started becoming stronger and there were not enough reserves to match the dollars. 1981, the dollar lost 2/3 of its purchasing powers, and thereafter it's been on the wane. The 2007-2008 global financial crisis further made nations realize that they had to de-dollarize. 2014, Russia prioritized de-dollarization, and 2022, volume of China-Russia trade in yuan. 2023, other nations looking away from the dollar. So all of these aspects have contributed. But like I said, even today, 60% of the world's central banks, their reserves are in dollar. So de-dollarization is a possibility, but is it going to be a reality in the near future? We'll have to wait and watch. There are many nations like India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Argentina, and the UAE, along with Russia and China, who are moving in this direction.